My name is Adrian Conway, and I've recently been working with the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage on how to move towards widespread implementation of a more nature-based approach to urban rainwater management. I had worked for many years in Dublin City Council, including working in this area. I'm delighted to be able to share this webinar. This is the fourth in a series. A number of you will have attended the previous webinars. It's great to see the level of interest in this issue, as evidenced by the very large numbers participating in this and the previous webinars. Before I introduce the first speaker, I just want to, I suppose, highlight the urgency around this. We've been talking about variations on nature-based solutions, sustainable urban drainage system for over 20 years, but I think it gets to the point now where we need to really rapidly move towards implementation rather than having a lot of plans and proposals. The urgency has been highlighted very recently by the World Meteorological Society organization only last week, which highlighted the fact that as near as 2027, we are 66% chance of exceeding the 1.5 degree threshold of global warming, resulting in an increased level of rainfall in Northern Europe. The timescale is very short in the context of delivering capital projects, so it does display the fact that we really need to be delivering these things now. You'll also be aware of again last week, the catastrophic floods in northern Italy. Over 50% of the average annual rainfall fell there in 36 hours. I noted from an editorial in yesterday's Irish Times, which covered this issue, that an Italian geologist had referred to intensive and disorderly urbanization as a factor in the resultant flooding. And this is something we need to be very aware of. We can't keep going on the way we're going, paving everything and having hard surfacing everywhere, and expect not to come to a bad result. The risk of pollution, apart from flooding, the risk of pollution of our watercourses from such rapid urban runoff, often following prolonged dry spells, is increased as a result of the changing climate. And this has been the experience the Water Framework Directive is emphasising, and the River Basin Management Plan is emphasising urban runoff as an increased risk. It's great to see presentations in the earlier webinars on nature-based urban projects that have been delivered. However, I also noted a presentation highlighting many recent projects where obvious opportunities were not taken to move away from the traditional and outdated approach of curbs, gullies and pipes. During my work at the department, I used to half-jokingly adopt the slogan of stop doing stupid things. And I would ask you to promote the required change of approach in your own area, because ultimately it's down to individuals to lead this. We're spending large amounts of public money on urban projects under a range of initiatives, including urban regeneration, active travel and town centres first. And people will be aware of a number of projects under those and various other headings. It's often an individual champions that drive change. So can I take this opportunity to ask each of you to identify those opportunities? Even if the project is at an advanced stage, one can often implement change and take action to deliver as many elements of nature-based rainwater management as possible, as quickly as possible. Curbs and gullies really should become the exception and not the rule. Our first speaker is Seán Fitzsimons, who will speak on the adoption of nature-based solutions on the interurban network. Seán is a chartered civil engineer and Fellow of Engineers Ireland with over 17 years experience in the planning, design, construction and administration of major construction works. He has worked in national and international infrastructure projects, which have included design and build, PPP, and traditional and remeasurable contract projects in Ireland, the UK, North Africa, and Eastern Europe. As well as being a chartered engineer for over 12 years, Seán is a qualified and experienced project manager for projects ranging from greenways, active travel schemes, local and regional roads, through to national roads and waterway projects up to 800 million euros. With particular expertise in stakeholder coordination, drainage, earthworks, design, and optimization, he has developed schemes to be brought forward for planning permission, acted in employers' representative teams, managed design teams, the contractors design, supervised works during construction. And some of you may have seen Seán's earlier presentation in one of the earlier webinars as well. So hand over to you, Seán, to start your presentation.
Thanks very much, Adrian. So today possibly slightly different to advertise. I'm just going to be talking about the application of nature-based drainage solutions on the interurban network, with a focus on the N4 Clooney to Castlebaldwin scheme that was opened a couple of years ago. So just a bit of context, I suppose, for those of us old enough to remember, the interurban network really commenced in earnest kind of as part of the Transport 2010 strategy, when the M3, the N4 corridor, the M6 corridor, the M7, M8, and N9 and M11 corridors were all developed. And typically in the development of those schemes, SUD systems were adopted. So not necessarily always nature-based solutions, but SUD systems were developed. So here's some examples. This is the M3, Clonee to Kells. This is the M6, PPP, Galway to East Ballinasloe. This is the N9, part of the N9 N10 scheme. And I think this is one of the sections on the N8. So just kind of, this is anecdotal, but as you can see, kind of there's nature-based or SUD solutions kind of associated with each of those projects, and they were the dominant type of drainage kind of through Transport 2010. Where we did have vulnerable areas in those schemes, typically the filter drains that you see in the pictures were lined with an impermeable liner. That's quite typical of other jurisdictions as well. We worked on a project in Scotland recently where the only drainage solution allowed is filter drains, and on embankments you use lined filter drains. In vulnerable areas you use lined filter drains as well. Through Transport 2010, we would say that concrete systems were limited to central medians, where you had a concrete barrier, high embankments where you weren't allowed to use over the edge, so over 6 meters you used not be allowed to use over the edge drainage, and some other niche areas. That approach by hook or by crook has changed on recent schemes. So recent schemes, there's been a greater emphasis, I suppose, on the need for seal systems. So as I mentioned here, recent schemes use concrete systems in areas deemed to be vulnerable. So the areas deemed to be vulnerable are wetlands, so you don't want to draw down the water. That's quite correct. In wetlands, karst areas and areas with high groundwater tables, so neither do you want to activate karst features if you're in a karst landscape, and you don't want to discharge directly to groundwater either. But then equally, kind of in areas of shallow overburden where there's underlying groundwater, you may determine that you require a seal system. And the result is that seal systems are being prescribed basically everywhere. You might get up to 80% of areas being deemed to be vulnerable for one reason or another. And there's no option provided for sealed nature-based drainage solutions within the TII standards. So that's, I suppose, the key message. There's no option for sealed nature-based drainage solutions. So there's no option for a lined filter drain in the TII standards. There's no option for a sealed grass surface water channel in the TII standards. And there's limited facility to use over the edge in areas that are deemed to be vulnerable. And I suppose the outcome of that is that I suppose the other thing that's changed is departures. Typically, we may apply for a departure for a lined filter drain or for a grass surface water channel, and those departures are typically, I would say, refused. So we I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we did on the N4 Clooney to Castlebaldwin project, which has broken the mold just slightly, and maybe kind of hopefully shown a way forward. So the scheme itself was a 14.7 kilometre dual carriageway, associated side roads that have got one compact grade separated junction, 2 roundabouts, 12 structures, 39 culverts, 3.3 million metres cubed of earthworks, and 327,000 metres squared of pavement, so 32 hectares of pavement, which would kind of, most of which is new pavement. So that would give you the scale of the new increase in paved area in Sligo. So obviously a very significant area of new pavement. Some of that, of course, would be kind of associated with local roads, but even those local roads would have been widened. The design team comprised of Fairley Timony, ourselves, CCC, Ramball, Byrne Atkins were the drainage checker, the employer was Sligo County Council, and the employer's representative was Barry Transportation. I suppose we came to the project with the approach of trying to maximise SUDS. So for all the environmental benefits that we know about, the water quality, water quantity, carbon footprint, and biodiversity kind of benefits associated with them, we would consider that there's a high risk from a designer's point of view with water quantity. Kind of associated with water quantity issues. One of the issues that we hear back about most, kind of following the development of the scheme, is that the scheme of this nature, I should say, is that the water quantity or the flooding downstream is increased. Is often a complaint from landowners downstream, and you want to be able to be in a position to address any of those queries when they do come in. We were working as a design and build, it was a design and build, so we were working on behalf of a contractor developing the design on behalf of a contractor, and they were obviously very interested in the lower cost of the drainage associated with SUDS. The development of SUDS also facilitated the optimization of the earthwork strategy. Probably not something I'll have time to go into today. Just kind of go through some of the works requirements that are typical on a large D&B project of this nature. There's a few that are pro-SUDS, let's say. So you need to meet the requirements of the environmental impact statements. They'll typically refer to SUDS, or they'll certainly address volume, runoff volume and runoff rate. And the only real way to address runoff volume is through the use of SUDS and nature-based drainage solutions. The works requirements will say that you should conform to the recommendations of the SUDS manual. That's always in there. And on the N4, we had a particular requirement to use the principle of SUDS. We also had these requirements to use seal systems. So a seal drainage system, locations that cut into bedrock, locations that are within 3 meters of the winter groundwater table. I suppose bear in mind when you're going through any area of peat, the winter groundwater table is at surface level. So locations that are within 3 meters of winter groundwater table is everywhere where you're crossing peat. Seal drainage system where you're in a karstic aquifer. I suppose you might also say where there's a risk of karstic aquifer. Also particular locations associated with environmental sensitivities, high to extreme aquifer vulnerability. So as I mentioned, could be talking about 80% of the scheme there. There's a definition of what sealed drainage shall be in the works requirements. It should be raised curbs and gullies, combined curb and drainage blocks, linear concrete drainage channels, and line swales to the approval of the employer's representative. We have seen that taken out of contracts previously, or we've argued for the use of swales and not being allowed to use swales to collect runoff at the base of embankments. And that hasn't met the approval of the employer's representative using swales at the base of embankments to collect runoff. They'll allow you to discharge into a line swale, but not outfall directly over the edge. That can vary. That people's interpretation of that can vary, is what I'm saying. Crucially, within the works requirements, we're told the grass surface water channels which are lined shall not be permitted in the work. So that's a serious deterrent for designers, who would otherwise like to use grass surface water channels. I suppose what we did do on the N4 is we looked at the EIS in detail. We're obviously very keen to use nature-based drainage solutions, and we found support for that approach within the environmental impact statement, which said that grass surface water channels will be used in cross sections, and it went on to say that where risks are identified and related to karstified bedrock or aquifer vulnerability, the grass surface water channels will be sealed and ponds will be sealed. So we applied for departure on that basis, noting that the requirements of the EIS are a legal requirement, and basically supersede any of our contract requirements, and the departure was ultimately granted. So we used there's two systems that we relied on, two nature-based drainage solutions that we relied on for a lot of the drainage along the N4, particularly in the sealed areas. We used lined grass surface water channels, and we used linear wetlands. We'll tell you a little bit about each one. As I mentioned, the lined grass surface water channel was subject to a departure, and we were granted that departure based on the contents of the EIS. Obviously, we also had the contract requirements to use such systems. Grass surface water channels had been used on other schemes previously, and lined grass surface water channels had been used on other schemes previously. Anecdotally, we had heard that there had been a problem with their use on other schemes. While the grass surface water channels were lined, what had happened is the water had come down the, this is just anecdotal, but what happened is the water had come down the edge of the pavement and gotten between the liner and the pavement layers and disappeared. You know, it couldn't be accounted for. And that's part of the reason why they were less popular than we argue they should be. So we developed this detail, and I'll go through the detail in a second, and we subjected that to a trial. So we tried a few different ways to ensure that that problem experienced on different projects that didn't reoccur here. So basically, I mean, again, relatively simple solution, but we lined the nailer to the pavement. I feel like a bit in a Father Ted episode saying we put the brick on the accelerator, but we nailed the pavement. We nailed the liner to the pavement. And we used a bituminous emulsion to tack it to the pavement as well. So kind of, you know, it ultimately was a relatively low-fi solution and not particularly complicated. The rest of the detail is as per the typical TII detail. The impermeable geomembrane is as per the Series 900 specification. And this is it being installed. So pavement installed, trench dug out, liner installed, very neat job. Backfilled with clause 804 material, which is part of the detail as called up in the drainage specification. Some debate as to whether that would need, you know, that actually needs to be clause 804 or not. But clause 804 is what's been put in. The liner was then sealed to the pavement. Need to get the details around the chambers right as well, just to make sure that the liner is carried through the chamber and that the water has a way of draining into the chamber from the base of the liner. And obviously then the whole thing is shaped and backfilled, and what we ultimately end up with is a grass surface water channel. This is some years later, grass surface water channel adjacent to the curb, or adjacent, no curb, I should say, adjacent to the road pavement. We do experience some issues with the grass surface water channel. So as you can see, kind of we're just parked in a lay-by here, and there's a vehicle that's pulled in and crossed over the grass surface water channel. There's potential that some of the liner could come away from the edge of the pavement as well. That, you know, is possibly happening there slightly, not entirely clear. But you know, I wouldn't be particularly concerned about the liner. I mean, ultimately, if that was a grass surface water channel, all the impacts associated. If that was a concrete surface water channel rather than the grass surface water channel, still risks of some water getting through. And it's about, you know, proportional risk, I would say. Kind of, if it was a concrete surface water channel, you'd have already incurred all the environmental costs associated with the production and laying of that concrete, and the, you know, the operational costs associated with using concrete. You know, all the missing benefits when you don't use nature-based drainage solutions. So, you know, proportionally, you know, I would be concerned about some elements of the liner getting away. I do think, you know, it's worthy of further research. Similarly here, kind of wouldn't be overly concerned about the rutting. That I expect that will fill in over time, kind of as the grass surface water channel is maintained. And obviously, you know, with all drainage systems, some maintenance is required. Crucially, there's been no reports of flooding, groundwater issues, karstification, wetland drawdown, etc. I suppose they're the things you're trying to avoid when you use seal systems, and there's been no reports of that. Quite unusual, actually. That I haven't heard any reports of increased water levels downstream. Normally you would kind of get one or two reports of that with these sort of schemes, but there's been none on this scheme. I should say that there's been no formal research done to date on the operation of the grass surface water channels, so we'll come to later. These are the detail for the linear wetland. We've got a class 2, but the detail is based around the swale detail within the TII publications. We've made some modifications to that. We incorporated check dams to slow and attenuate the runoff. So they're quite frequent on steep ground, just to make sure that you make the most of the space available for attenuation. We included a berm where necessary so that we could separate the surface water runoff from the road from flood waters where we're in a flood zone. And where it's not shown in the detail here, but where we were in a sealed areas, we carried out testing to ensure the material was sufficiently impermeable. That was quite a crucial point, actually. There was a suggestion that we'd need to use an impermeable liner underneath the swale, and what that would have meant it would have meant digging out the impermeable material, the in situ impermeable material, peat material underneath the swale, in order to put in a impermeable geomembrane. So obviously an artificial product with a lifespan of 20 or 30 years. So we argued that we'd be much better off testing the in situ material, checking that it is impermeable, which we expected to be the case, and using that as a means of saying that the system is impermeable. So the linear attenuation systems, they collect surface water runoff, they convey the water, and they treat and attenuate. So it's an all-in-one system. We were able to kind of navigate some spatial constraints. So obviously this wasn't there as part of the specimen or the tender design, but we were fortunate enough to be able to make some alignment modifications, reduce embankments, and generate the space for the swales where we wanted to put them in, little linear wetlands where we wanted to put them in. And as I mentioned, we use check dams to maximize the storage. So this is a picture of the wetlands being installed. A couple more of those. You can kind of see peaty material there that being installed in, check dams in, and this is them in operation here. So yeah, not sure there's too much to say there. I know the contractor was Roadbridge, and unfortunately they went into liquidation kind of just shortly after the road opened. I probably would have expected these pictures were taken in April. They weren't there to follow up on some of the landscaping measures, but landscaping was completed, but through the establishment period there was nobody looking after it, so there may be some landscaping missing there. It's an overview. So what we have here is a grass surface water channel, grass surface water channels on either side of the road. They outfall down into a wetland here system. This wetland is quite wide because it's taking runoff not just from the road adjacent, but also from the cut slope. We've got a narrow wetland on the other side that would just be taking the road runoff there. We do still have some concrete channels, but they're limited to niche areas such as structures. So what's happening here is the concrete channel is crossing over the structure, and it'll outfall to a linear wetland prior to its ultimate outfall. There are significant savings on the drainage bill associated with the adoption of the nature-based drainage solutions shown. So we got rid of close to 10 kilometres of pipe drainage and associated chambers on the main line and side roads relative to the tender design. We got rid of all of the pipe drainage on the access tracks, so 7 kilometres of that, used over the edge on access tracks instead. That resulted in the removal of 11 kilometres of concrete surface water channel and curb slot drains. So it's obviously a very significant scale. When you're dealing with a large highway project like this, the scale is large. And we installed just over 9 kilometres of grass surface water channel in lieu of the concrete surface water channel. The wetlands, a little bit more efficient as well in terms of volumes for attenuation, and we saved 40,000 meters cubed in excavation volume for attenuation systems, which was significant. We also did a carbon audit on the changes to the drainage design and found that we'd saved over 1,000 tons of CO2 through the implementation of these measures. So that's equivalent to about 2.7 million kilometers in a combustion engine car. So there is some, I suppose, needs for research, we would say, and I have some suggested updates as well to the TII standards or works requirements to facilitate the broader use of nature-based drainage solutions. So I suppose the first thing to say is the March 2015 TII drainage standard updates were, the intention of them was to promote SUDs, but I suppose the outcome in conjunction with a change in strategy is and look, this is to some extent anecdotal, but I would say that it's been rather than SUDs measures being increased, they're probably decreased. So that's something that needs to be considered. And probably research kind of, like I said, kind of what I'm saying is anecdotal, kind of based on what I've seen around the place. But it'll be interesting to see what the statistics would show. The liner using the grass surface water channel is providing adequate protection. You don't need to test underneath the liner to make sure that no contaminants are getting below the liner. I think that would be a project that's worth doing. But B, I think it would be be interesting to see if the liner is in fact necessary, or if all the contaminants are being trapped in the upper layers of the grass surface water channel. And it would be interesting to test a grass surface water channel that doesn't have a liner, to see if there's any contaminants making it kind of 600 mils down from the surface of the grass surface water channel. I'd also be interested to know if the outflows from the nature-based drainage solutions match the conservative design calculations. So within the design calculations for nature-based drainage solutions, we're not currently allowing for any infiltration, and it's effectively assumed that all the water that runs off the road makes it to the outfall via the nature-based drainage solution, and everything's designed with that in mind. It's a very, very conservative approach, and it means that any pipes that you're using, any ponds that you're sizing, etc., are probably quite significantly oversized. Not necessarily the end of the world, I suppose, but it'd be interesting to kind of check it in any case. So some suggested updates to the TII standards and the works requirements, the typical set of works requirements to facilitate the use of nature-based drainage solutions. So I think, subject to the research, TII should consider adopting a detailed fur-line grass surface water channel that would allow the adoption of nature-based drainage solutions in areas that are sensitive, in areas which require sealing. Equally, kind of updates to allow grass surface water channels on embankments greater than 1.5 meters. So at the minute they're limited to embankments up to 1.5 meters. We think they could safely be used on embankments higher than 1.5 meters, and that would allow you to get rid of the remaining concrete channels that we say are used in niche areas. They could be removed entirely. Making the use of non-nature-based solutions and concrete systems a departure. Given all we've heard today and kind of the impact that concrete systems and the use of concrete in general, I would say, has on the environment and the water environment, we would argue that the use of concrete systems should probably be a departure, and done by exception rather than by rule. And probably a more broader review of the standard set of works requirements to remove the inconsistencies and remove the clauses that promote the use of concrete systems. So, that's it.
Thanks very much, Seán. Our next speaker is Ian Titherington, who will speak on maintenance consideration of the Cardiff experience. After a short spell as a student engineer in the former NIAT, I'm sure I pronounced it wrong, Borough Council, Ian was a civil engineer in Cardiff Council for over 32 years, specialising in all forms of drainage design, rehabilitation and maintenance, along with other areas of municipal engineering, including waste management. For the last 10 years in that post, he concentrated on drainage elements, new development, specifically SUDs and the development of retrofit SUDs. This included devising, along with Jeremy Jones, now at Atkins, and leading on the Greener Grangetown project, after which he was made UK SUDs champion. He was a SAB officer with the SUDs Approval Board in Cardiff for the first four years of the Welsh statutory SUDs legislation, helping to deliver statutory SUDs for the capital. He's also currently invited onto advisory groups from CIWAM to the Institute of Civil Engineers, helping to inform on flood risk and all things related to SUDs. His new role is a senior advisor on sustainable drainage for the Welsh government. So without further ado, hand over to you, Ian.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me. It's greatly appreciated. P'nawn da, everyone from Wales. I'm going to talk about maintenance and SUDs and retrofit SUDs this afternoon. In terms of two schemes recently completed in Cardiff. One is a city centre scheme, which might be more relevant to Cork or Dublin or such places. And one is a residential street, which would be probably more relevant to the cities and towns and more rural communities in relation to Ireland, and talk specifically about the different challenges and top tips effectively on how to manage maintenance, design for maintenance, consult for maintenance, and realize that it's something you need to start at the beginning of the scheme and not at the end of the scheme. So I'll flick through 2 schemes and I'll sum up at the end to go through the key factors. Just a few points. Such maintenance is set at the very start of a project when initial design, concept and feasibility are being considered. All elements of design influence maintenance. Any completed scheme that requires frequent and costly maintenance is a poor design. There's no grey areas on that one. If you're in there a lot maintaining, I think we all know it won't be maintained. It has to be designed for infrequent maintenance, easy access. It's very, very important, and that's considered from the very start. In an urban setting, a busy and quiet residential location will be heavily influenced on maintenance considerations. I'll start through the schemes and I'll talk through what I mean. The first one is called Central Square in Wood Street in city centre Cardiff. This is about as centre as you get in terms of Welsh urban identity. It's near the stadium. It's near the new BBC studios. It's by the river. It's an old part of the city full of services, hugely challenging, next to where the new bus interchange is going to be placed. These are the challenges. This is the street prior to any of the work being done. High-rise buildings. There's a new 30-story building going in next to this. And on bottom left is a typical match day with rugby. The street is full. All the streets are closed around the city centre. So effectively, you have to design and think about maintenance in terms of footfall in a busy street. And on the bottom right is a really good example of the services that they face in terms of design and maintenance. You have to design in terms of maintenance access as well. This is the actual scheme design. It involves about 13 tree cell systems to the south of the road and about half a dozen elliptical rain gardens to the north. The elliptical rain gardens are designed partly in mind in terms of cycling, but also partly in mind in terms of footfall, high footfall from stadium events. You have to design so people don't walk over them. You have to think about maintenance of the vegetation, think about maintenance of the trees, think about trip hazards. All these elements are brought in from the very, very start in terms of maintenance. All the trees that are chosen are low leaf fall, low fruit fall. So they're low in maintenance in terms of leaf fall, low in maintenance in terms of fruit fall, which can be problematic for cars. So all these things are thought about in terms of maintenance, including the vegetation. I know one of my colleagues, Isla, will be talking about vegetation later in the presentation. Again, a little bit more detail about the rain gardens, how they're designed in terms of allowing for footfall, in terms of cycling, as well as traffic. Talking very closely with highways colleagues about curves on the corners in terms of bus accesses and wheelbases on buses. This scheme actually had to be changed halfway through because they bought a new fleet of buses and they didn't go around the corner very well. So all these things come into account, and access for maintenance. This is a quick picture showing installation. The top left is actually a concrete base wall we decided to put in next to the green blue urban soil cell boxes. Not in any design codes. We spoke to highway engineers. They were worried about lateral loading in a busy street with flush curbs that we were installing. So we tried to placate those concerns by putting a base wall to deal with any lateral loading. So those systems had long-term structural integrity, needing almost no maintenance subsurface. So basically giving the longevity and ensuring the highways are happy. And obviously you can see these cells being installed in the center and top. And the picture on the bottom right is the finished rain gardens, which have got flush curbs on a busy road with cycle lanes separate. This is going to be the new bus terminal is going to be next to this. The reason why we put flush curbs in is when you have a busy road, you design rain gardens for the area of highway to soil, which roughly in a busy road is about 5:1 highway to soil. You have a lot of pollution off a busy road, so you have to think about how you manage the silt off the highways. That's probably the single biggest challenge. What we've done in this particular site, we've made the areas as wide as possible to deal with the silt, and the vegetation will break down a lot of the silt, but the plan is to probably scrape and remove the silt every 6 months on the edge of the rain garden because the loading is so heavy in a busy highway. The second example is Greener Grange Town. This was a scheme completed about 5 years ago, a residential scheme, retrofit scheme, a combination partnership between Cardiff Council, Cymru Welsh Water and Natural Resources Wales. This is a plan showing the scheme and a few key facts. 12 streets, moving about 42,000 square meters of runoff from the combined network and using grass and gravity to put it in the river. Over 107, I think 108 rain gardens, through 4 new outfalls, including all the elements associated with rain gardens, because we tried to do the street renewal at the same time. This scheme, in terms of consultation, that was very, very significant. When you're doing retrofit in a residential area where you've got businesses, that conversation rather than consultation is important. And the reason why it's important for maintenance is you get locals involved. If you get locals feeling an element of trust with what you're trying to do, they feel they've been listened to in terms of design, because this is the street that they live in and they work in, it's personal to them. You involve them, they feel a personal link with these things and they look after them. That means maintenance. So design challenges, parking, obviously, existing trees, unlike Plymouth, we try not to chop down the trees we've got. We're trying to add to the canopy we've got in Cardiff, like many cities are doing now. So working around those existing trees with designs is important. Cycle routes, very, very important in terms of access for maintenance for cycle routes. You've got to think about the vehicles in terms of accessing for maintenance, street lighting, signage, access, maintenance. Maintenance isn't just about the SUDS features, it's maintaining things that are already in the streetscape. You've got to work with high-risk colleagues on telematics, on lighting, on signage, with your parks colleagues on managing green open space and existing trees. All these elements come into maintenance when you're doing SUDS and retrofit SUDS. I mentioned earlier about consultation, conversation, community action. This is a classic example of Green at Grangetown, where we had public meetings, we had street surgeries in the open air, we invited families along, we used the schools for conversations with the parents. It's really, really important. I can't overstate, if you're serious about communities taking pride in where they live and looking after what they have, with really, really tight council funding, the consultation enables you to get the locals involved, and they really, really take pride in what they do. And this is a typical poster we used. We gave people options in terms of designs. Very, very important again to say, you said we did. You know, this particular street changed designs on 6 occasions because the locals honed it down to what they wanted. We gave choice about trees, about shrubbery, what they looked at different times of year in terms of seasonal colouring. We really went down to that level. They really felt involved. They felt part of the scheme. So they take a lot of pride. They do a lot of most of the litter picking in these areas is done by locals, not by the council. They volunteer. They do it to take pride in it. They do weeding. They look after things, and that is an essential element of delivering the scheme. Again, this is an example of it. On certain weekends, we involve local families to do planting. We supply the PPE, and the kids and the parents could get in and dig. And the one on the right is a good example of a local school, primary school, planting a rain garden, and that's what it looked like after 12 months. So these elements are very, very important in terms of consultation, particularly when you retrofit in an existing community. Maintenance. The middle bottle is of a street that didn't go through a rain garden, just went through a gully and went straight to the river, or went straight to the sewer. The other bottles are the one immediately to the right is a street that did go through a rain garden. That black gunk in the middle is a combination of hydrocarbons, suspended solids, metals, ethanols, and microplastics, of which there are quite a lot off the highway. It's a real gunk that you find on a rain garden. So catching that heavy silt and treating that heavy silt and designing your system to manage that pollutant load in a manageable way is absolutely critical. As well as gaining environmentally, it's about keeping the maintenance down. Just a couple of pictures before and after. No, that street didn't have a lot of maintenance prior to the work, as you can see, but it still required maintenance. It still required, street lighting maintenance, tree maintenance. It was basically a car park. And this is what happened after the scheme. You have got more maintenance in terms of vegetation and trees. The trees are in tree cells. The locals do a lot of the litter picking and do a lot of the weeding. I'm literally down this street this weekend because the weather's nice. I've been told by one of the locals to do it because I used to work for the council. I'm going to go around with a wheelbarrow this weekend, pulling out some brambles. But basically, these systems we went into COVID, they hadn't been touched for 3 years. They work perfectly because they've been designed to work perfectly. The soil is engineered to the right level. The plants are chosen. The trees are chosen. The system works. It's self-cleansing velocity. The maintenance is less because the design is right for the location and the installation is right. Two key factors. I'll finish on this. I tried to list a few things that I felt were relevant. In terms of design, when you're doing SUDs, make it relevant to the location, whether it's new build or whether it's retrofit. Make it relevant to the location. Don't find something online and stick it in because it probably won't work. It's so important to get design right for that location. Installation, don't assume the contractor knows how to install a rain garden or any other SUDs feature because they probably don't. So it's very important you give site support. You can call it supervision, call it support. And they need that when you install. A contractor will look at a soil and they'll see it as landscaping. They won't see it as engineering. A SUDs feature is civil engineering that is landscaped, not landscaping that is engineered. So it's very, very important that when they're installing, they know what soil to put in. They know what level to put that soil in. They don't set it at a level thinking it's going to sink because bioretention soil does not sink. And if it does, you've got a problem. And make sure the levels are right, make sure the inlets are right, make sure the water flows onto the soil. I've seen many installations where the soil is higher than the inlet. Water doesn't go sideways, it goes down. I know that sounds stupid, it's quite common. Material choice is very important. Think about materials you can use in terms of carbon footprint, but also in terms of buildability. Sometimes we design such features that look great, almost impossible to install, almost impossible to build. Have that conversation with the contractor. Make sure they price accordingly for that because you don't want to lose money because they didn't understand what they were installing. So the materials choice is very, very important, not just in terms of carbon footprint, but in terms of longevity, in terms of access. Allowance for location. Again, I talked about a city centre location and a residential location. Your maintenance will be more in the city centre. For two reasons. You've got a big footfall, so you're going to have more people walking past, sober or drunk, and you will have a lot more vehicles. You will have a much higher pollutant loading off the highway. So you have to design accordingly for those elements. One top tip I always give, which isn't written in the SUDS manual, always put in trees of a certain size. If you put them in too small, you'll always get someone coming out of a corner pub after 10 pints of Guinness on a Friday night trying to snap the tree. I know that sounds stupid, but it's actually true. We lose more trees and vegetation from people having a few pints and pulling them out or snapping them than we do from frost, from vehicles, from anything else. Think about when you design SUDs, it's 50% hydraulics, 50% human nature. Think about human nature and how people perceive those features. Very, very important. Again, mentioning the community consultation and conversation, particularly in a residential area or where you've got businesses. You cannot talk enough to them. Involve them to the point that they get bored of you asking questions. When they start complaining they're getting too much information, you've hit the baseline. Really, really involve them, because when you involve them, not only do they understand what you're doing, but they also support what you're doing and look after what is installed. Silt management is a very, very important element, because what we are learning and what we have learned in Cardiff is the silt can be a real issue for soil. The current British standard for bioretention soil in the UK is wrong. It's based on a green roof, not on a rain garden. I know Isla's going to talk about this later. It's really important to have a gritty, stony, gritty soil with an element of growth material in it. But what that allows is the movement for the contaminated water through the medium in order to make sure the voids are not blocked. It's really, really important. It's not just a sandy soil. It will not work with a rain garden. You really, really need to get the advice of Isla on soil, because unfortunately at the moment, the advice on the British standards is wrong. And the final point is planned maintenance. Obviously in Wales, we've got statutory SUDS legislation, which we've had for 4 years, and you have to have planned maintenance. Who's responsible, how often you're going to maintain that, signed off, or you can't build and you can't start your works. It's very, very important to have that planned and also funded. We're currently having conversations with Welsh Water where set retrofit work has been done, the possibilities of them working with local authorities to help funding maintenance, because obviously it helps them to take water out of the combined network, and it's a win-win for everyone. These are the sort of relationships you need in order to manage maintenance with the community, with the council, with local businesses, because I understand more than anyone working in local government for over 30 years that maintenance budgets are incredibly tight. So design for it to be infrequent and involve the local community and get your elements of design specific for that location in time. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Seán. And our next speaker is Isla Jackson, who will speak on plants and landscaping, what, where, and when. Isla is the Director of Civic Engineers and leads the Scottish Studios. She's passionate about building and the spaces in between the buildings. As a chartered engineer, she aims to create inspirational structures and places that have a positive impact on the environment and enable people to lead happier and healthier lives. Skills Isla has developed, coupled with the active role engineers are playing in addressing the climate emergency, have found her looking at 5 key principles when designing projects: exploring, not exploiting; building, not destroying; reusing, not just using; listening and learning; and climate resilience. Our work includes leading on all structural, civil and transport engineering projects for the practice in Scotland and Ireland, which includes Block A of the transformative Glasgow Avenue. A selection of other projects which she has been involved in are Glasgow Woodside Making Places, Edinburgh North Grove, Inverness Heritage Trail, and South Dublin District Centres. Isla is also an approved certifier of design, building structures, and a trained principal designer under CDM 2015. So Isla, hand over to you.
Afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much, and thanks very much for inviting me to speak at today's webinar. Been asked to talk about plants and landscaping, what, where, and when. Just a point: I'm an engineer. I'm not a landscape architect, and obviously there is specialist disciplines for that. But what we want to cover today is how to sort of approach as an engineer the planting of rain gardens and the philosophy behind it. So just to touch briefly on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure everybody is quite familiar with, but it's good to note that there is a number of things in there that do affect us basically as engineers who are designing rain gardens. So clean water, life below water, life on land, climate action, sustainable cities and communities. So all of the work that we're doing here and the things that we're promoting are backed up by the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is a global approach. Just a bit about planning for nature-based solutions. It should be well designed and wherever possible multifunctional. So it shouldn't just be drainage. A good design would be that it provides biodiversity. You're putting in potential buffering between footpaths and active travel routes. And basically these rain gardens can be a number of different things, so you're getting a lot of bang for your buck basically. So policy is your friend, and I would encourage you to have a look at different policy documents that are available to you. Stewardship of MBS, so basically how do we manage it? The success of rain gardens is absolutely critical, and particularly in the first 3 years of their development. If they start looking a bit scrappy and not very attractive, people will start to lose faith that they're doing what they need to do. So it's really important that we get that maintenance correct, and that people are bought into it, as Ian was saying, whether that's the community, whether it's the council, whether it's the developer who's funding that. It is almost always will come down to where that funding has come from, and proper planned approach in the early stages of design is absolutely critical. Just a few slides on things that are happening in Scotland, which is where I'm based. So Edinburgh's got some quite nice documents in terms of water management, and they've sort of broken it down into regional, citywide policy projects, influential studies and projects. I suppose it's good to note that this is quite a fast-moving science, if you like. There are different projects that are being put on the ground all the time. It's not particularly frequent at the moment, even in Scotland or Wales or England. It is quite difficult to try and convince quite often councils to put in the nature-based solutions, despite all of the policies are pointing towards them. So again, it's having that sort of approach, understanding what the policy is, and sort of mirroring that back to the different colleagues that we have in councils, just to remind them that this is something that needs to be dealt with, and dealt with quickly, given the state of the climate emergency we find ourselves in. The MGSDP, which I always get a bit mixed up with, but that's the Metropolitan Glasgow Strategic Drainage Partnership, and they're responsible for looking across the Glasgow region on different types of sustainable drainage or nature-based solutions. So there's different things across each city, and that'll be very similar in Ireland. There's some nice documents that have been produced. The Irish Green Building Council has quite a nice one that I found online. Biodiversity in the built environment. Again, that supports what we're trying to achieve here. And again, you know, just a quick Google search will give you some of the backup that you need, and some really interesting sort of facts and figures, which are always useful when you're in the early stages of design, and just trying to convince people that this is the right thing to do, and we do need to adopt this approach. Just in terms of a case study, this is the Grey to Green in Sheffield, which was one of the very first really quite major ones that was put in. You can see there that it was on a slight hill. Rain gardens have been installed, and it's been a hugely successful project. The planting is really successful, and interestingly, you know, it's been widely accepted as being a really as I say, successful project. There have been lessons that have been learned outside of Sheffield in terms of the soil makeup, composition, and so on. So again, you know, we're learning as we go, and every project that goes into the ground is an opportunity to learn from that and better for the next one. So you can see there that there's as Ian had been talking about, there's no upstand curb. That is something that we've struggled to get approved in Glasgow, and I'll come on to the Glasgow avenues in a later few slides. But there are different ways that you can get this, but this is the best way, because the water can flow directly into the rain gardens without it silting up around about castellated upstands. You can see as well on the sort of bottom left-hand slide that that in the early days, the establishment is absolutely critical, but it's not going to look absolutely brilliant from day one. And I think, again, that is down to the engagement with the key stakeholders, the business owners, the communities that surround these, that, you know, that it does take some time for it to establish. And obviously the seasons will change how it looks as well. So again, having it looking absolutely brilliant on the bottom right-hand image is not always the way it's going to look. That during midwinter it is going to look a little bit more sparse. So again, it's that sort of education and engagement with people to help them understand what we're trying to do. In terms of the soil that was used in Sheffield, this was quite an early approach, and again, as Ian had said, the British standards sort of promote this green roof type soil. We've kind of moved away from that, and we're working with academic partners to try and address what is the best type of soil, and that can be quite localised depending on your area. Again, we'll touch on a case study that we're doing in Cork, which is close to the sea as well, which can impact on the selection. But basically, it's to be aggregate stone if we can get that. And what they went with was a 70-20-10 split. And as I say, that is something that we are looking at across the piece. So it's something that you can work, as I say, with different academic partners or through demonstrator or pilot projects to get the right mix to suit your area. Just in terms of risk-based approach, quite often we can get a bit of pushback in terms of level changes, particularly adjacent to footpaths. And really it's about discussing that with your council colleagues right from the very start. The best ones look that don't have barriers all over the place, but again it can depend on what the sort of policy is in your area. So early engagement is absolutely critical to get your detailing right, because if these things start coming up towards the end of a project, it can really start to delay things, and it delays things going on site. In terms of the Sheffield project, they worked with a sort of community organisation, if you will, called Green Estate, which was a really interesting way of doing it. AME were responsible for the maintenance generally, but they worked with Green Estate in the early days of the Sheffield project. and that worked exceptionally well because they basically worked with the community and they created jobs. They were a local community organisation, and they helped to maintain these rain gardens, as I say, in the early days, which helped them really establish, and it's testament to the successful outcome. We've done some academic research, as I mentioned. This was something that was done with Glasgow City Council and Strathclyde University, based in Glasgow. This was in the early days of the Glasgow Avenues project, a place called Washington Street in Glasgow city centre. 4 different test cells were put in with 4 different soil mixes. Again, we've kind of moved on from where we were originally, but basically what we did was disconnected a gully to take rainwater that would have gone straight into the system, and distributed that across the 4 different test cells, and then tested the water as it came out at the other end. It's probably worth noting that these were put in just before the pandemic, and they were not maintained over a course of about 2 years. So whilst they look a bit scrappy, I think it does show that even with zero maintenance, you know, they can flourish. It just depends on your planting mix. So we looked at the 4 different soil measures that we put into each of the different containers, and we came up with one that was particularly good. So the water quality that came out of the end of the rain gardens was much improved, particularly in terms of removal of hydrocarbons, etc. We didn't look at microplastics in this particular study, but we will be doing that on the Cork project, and I'll move on to that later on in the presentation. This is the Glasgow Avenues, which is a major project within Glasgow City Council, Glasgow City Centre. 17 streets, £115 million worth of city deal funding, and it's taken quite a while to get it to a point where we could get it to site. There was Sauchiehall Street went in originally. No real nature-based solutions other than trees went in on Sauchiehall Street. As you can see there, that's Cambridge Street is ready to go to construction. It's actually out for tender at the moment, and we are proposing to put in rain gardens in that urban setting. So once we get that on the ground, we can use some of the lessons that we've learned from the academic research that we've undertaken with Strathclyde, and just see whether they work actually on the ground. Interestingly, in Glasgow, the topography all runs towards the River Clyde. So ideally what we would do is get the water out of the rain gardens and straight to the Clyde, and get it to a quality that is actually acceptable without it going into the combined system, because Glasgow's combined sewer system is currently over capacity. And as climate emerges, as the climate changes, basically more intense rainfall events will mean that there will be untreated sewer spills into the river more frequently. So if we can take some of that water out of that combined system at an earlier stage via rain gardens, those sewer spills will become less frequent, and it actually frees up capacity for further development, which is one of the key objectives of the Glasgow Avenues project. So it's well worth, I'd say, keeping an eye on what's happening in Glasgow as these projects start to get implemented on the ground. Argyll Street at the bottom left-hand corner there is a particularly challenging street. It has a low-level rail tunnel, which the crown of the tunnel is only about 300 mil below the running surface of the road. So getting rain gardens into that street is particularly difficult because all the utilities are crammed either side into the footpaths. So we've really struggled to try and get that to work, but we've now got a solution that we think is going to be successful. And one block is going in front of the new JP Morgan Bank building, which has just been constructed on Argyll Street. And that will give us a real understanding of what the profile of that tunnel looks like. That tunnel is live, so we've obviously got to deal with network rail, etc. So that's quite challenging, and it just shows the type of things that we have to deal with when trying to install nature-based solutions in an urban environment. In terms of species selection for rain gardens, there's actually there's very few studies that have been undertaken that give us a completely, a list of plants that you can and should use. And that's because rain gardens obviously will cycle between being potentially completely wet to being completely dry. And as Ian had mentioned, the soil profile is absolutely critical in terms of the attenuation of the water. So the void ratio and what you're actually trying to achieve, the size of the rain gardens based on the amount of water that you're trying to manage coming off the road. So again, that there is still studies to be done, and I would encourage people to do pilot schemes and demonstrators to see what works in your area. But there are some planting lists that we can share, which are quite interesting and a good starting point. There was a piece of academic research that was done by Nigel Dunnett, who was heavily involved in the Sheffield project, and that gives an interesting sort of understanding of the different areas within a rain garden. So down in the base, it can be quite flooded and wet, whereas it can become quite dry as you get out towards the margins of the rain garden. So again, depending on the profile of the rain gardens that you're looking at, can depend on the species selection that you have. These slides will be available. I know there's quite a lot of information on here, so they will be available after the webinar. Another thing to consider in terms of your planting plans is the erosion of soil surfaces, trapping silt and preventing resuspension, filtering, treating pollution, providing wildlife habitat, which would be a great biodiversity element within a scheme, and providing visual attractive landscape benefits. One thing to note though is that we should try and avoid aggressive plants, invasive species and so on. So what we don't want to be doing is creating a further issue further down the line. So again, selecting a correct planting list is quite critical and should be done at an early stage in the project with the assistance of ecologists and landscape architects based on what the engineered solution is going to be. Just in terms of good practice, I'm not going to read through all of these, but you know, it's all to do with the correct timing of everything, making sure that your density, the pattern works for the area that you're looking for, and basically whether a key thing, particularly for the engineers, is how deep you've actually got to play with. In Argyle Street in Glasgow, it's quite shallow because of the tunnel. Can actually go quite a bit deeper if you weren't constrained in that way. Again, that might affect what your planting selection would be. So the key thing is to have plants that are durable, that are appropriate for the area that you're putting them in, and will work well across the seasons, so that you don't have 6 months of the year at looking pretty unattractive. Whilst it will still function as a drainage solution, it is key that they do also look attractive and they add to the placemaking opportunities that they're in, particularly in city centres. In terms of street trees, it's really key to get these in, as Ian had said, as large mature trees, and that again could mean that you have to work with your partners to make sure that these are procured early. They may even need to be procured before the contract, the tender of the rest of the scheme goes out, because they can take about a year depending on where they're being sourced from. So it is really key to start talking about trees if they're going into your schemes early, and understanding what procurement challenges you may have. So having large trees, particularly in urban areas, is absolutely key, but getting them, they can be expensive and they can take time in terms of a lead-in. So what's been discussed in Glasgow is actually buying these trees and then allowing the contractor to call them off. But again, that needs a bit of thought at the very early stages in terms of getting these in. Size of trees are also important, particularly if they are going to influence sight lines, in terms of maintenance as well, foliage, etc. And having them in the right location and established early. You can either go with Stockholm soil, which again is something that's used quite frequently in Europe. There are the sort of green blue urban crates that you can use as well. So depending on the size that you've got and whether you can filtrate directly, that's something to consider when you're looking at trees. I won't go through all of this information, but again, it just gives you an idea of the different tree pits and trenches and the species that you can select depending on what you've got. So this is an extract from the Edinburgh Guidance, which is available online to anybody. So again, we can provide that information to you if you need it. In terms of maintenance for nature-based solutions, we've probably all mentioned that that early year 1 and 2 is absolutely critical. There's a bit more of an intensity. Again, thinking about this early, you can build that into a contract. You can have the contractor actually managing that 1 to 2 year maintenance burden, and then it can then be pushed on to just the normal council sort of maintenance from year 3 onwards. So again, that's a bit of thought process about quite early on in a design process of how this is going to be managed, but it is really important that it's done at an early stage so that the rain gardens have the best possible chance of establishing well. So, but you can see from year 3 onwards, you know, it's not a particularly onerous task, 6 monthly, annually. It should really be pretty well established by that point. And, you know, I just don't accept that, you know, that the maintenance is something that it should be used as a reason not to put these in. You have to maintain road gullies anyway, you have to maintain tarmac. So maintaining a rain garden is really no more onerous than that. So it's all about how councils have their budgets, whether it's the parks department, whether it's the roads department, whether it's the drainage department. Really, it's a slightly it's a different thing that we're trying to achieve here, and that will take some time until councils have kind of got to a point where it's not in different silos of different pots of money. So that can be a challenge, but as I say, once it's established, it should be relatively straightforward. Again, there's a whole various different types of nature-based solutions and different types of maintenance that can be used. So there's various documents that can give you some guidance on that. But again, it all kind of comes back to, you know, that first year 1 and 2 is the critical phase. This is a case study of a project that was done in Glasgow. Again, this is another test project. This is below the M8, really busy motorway that runs through Glasgow city centre, for anybody that knows it. Really hostile environment that cuts the West End off from the city centre. And this was a project that was funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies in advance of the COP26 conference that was held in Glasgow. And basically it was about artwork, but also we built in some nature-based solutions using precast drainage. It was called Waterworks. It's all about how the water falls off the motorway. It can come off in big sheets when it's been raining heavily, and that's quite a difficult route for people to try and manage. There's also a train station in there which is pretty underused at the moment. This was partly successful, certainly from the engagement of the community and brightening up the space. It was super successful. But in terms of disconnecting the rainwater pipe from the motorway above, it was quite challenging because there was a lot of silt above and it wasn't maintained the way that we had expected. So sometimes you have to accept that these pilot projects can fail, and actually the lessons learned are really, really helpful for moving forward. We went with a kind of fern-like planting species in here because it was quite dark. Just some technical drawings which that sort of showed how we disconnected that, treated the water through the different various heights of rain gardens, and then released it back into the system because there was nowhere else for it to go, and there certainly couldn't have been any infiltration in that area. But the idea had been that would actually reduce the amount of flow and attenuate the water before it went into the system, thereby slowing it down. We're local to yourselves. We're working with Cork County Council at the moment in terms of a project, and this is a demonstrator very similar to the one that I showed you at Washington Street in Glasgow. We're going to disconnect a gully, East Beach, which is where this will be located, for a period of about 12 months. It certainly is what we're looking at the moment. And again, there'll be 4 test cells of different soils. We're going to use the best soil that was found in Glasgow as the baseline, and then different ones that we've been working with and in discussion with the ENM and others about how things are developing in terms of the best soil solution. And what will happen out of the back of this is that the bigger project, which is in Westbourne Place, which also has a similar sort of section in terms of the profile, hopefully the information that we'll gain from this will be able to feed into that and make that a much more successful permanent project in the long run. What we're going to look at in terms of the Cove project, and we didn't look at this in Glasgow, is the microplastics. Cove is right next to the sea, and any overflow straight into the sea from any carriageway drainage that overflows is going to have microplastics in it, and this is becoming much more of a hot topic, and there's a variety of different papers that are being produced think there's a graph there just at the bottom that shows that Ireland is actually the second worst in Europe in terms of microplastics getting into fresh water and coastal systems. So this is something that we do need to look at, and we'll be working with University College Cork and the University of Strathclyde to try and establish how much is in there and how much the rain gardens can actually help to remove that before it can be released. This is just another technical drawing. I wouldn't dwell too much on it. But this is the species list that is currently proposed for Cove. Again, it is selecting species that are good for the location that they're in is critical, but it's also critical that they are going to do well in a kind of well-drained soil, if you will. So this is a demonstrator. We're going to try out a few different ones. They're quite good for coastal environments. They're quite attractive. Some may do better than others, but that's the whole point of a demonstrator project, is to actually get on the ground and see what it's like in situ. So this is something that the contractor is actually on the ground at the moment, literally started this week, and hopefully we will start with engagement with the school children and the rest of the community shortly. There's been some really nice boards that have been developed by Cork County Council in terms of engaging the children, because we've found that they can really buy into what we're trying to achieve, and then they'll go home and talk to their parents and try and explain it to them. So this is Ricky the Rain Garden, who has been born for the Cove demonstrator, and these boards I think are very similar to the ones that Ian had sort of talked about in Greener Grangetown, trying to explain why are we doing this and what it's all about. So these are critical, I think, to engaging with the community, and this is why we're doing this demonstrator project early on, is to try and start engaging with people before the construction work starts, which can be quite difficult for a community. And then just finally, we're working on an NTA Suds pocketbook at the moment, so I would just encourage you to look out for that. That should be issued in the next month or so, or even earlier. And that sort of tries to give sort of practical advice on installing rain gardens in Ireland. So hope you found that interesting, and I'm happy to take any questions. Okay.
Okay, thanks very much, Isla. Before we go to the Q&A now, I would thank all the earlier speakers for going through the questions very well during the sessions there, and I see a lot of them have been responsive online, so hopefully you can monitor and access those responses. So we won't be going back over all those, because frankly we wouldn't have time. We hope to have a brief Q&A at the end. I hope, even if we do run slightly over the half one, hopefully a lot of you can stay with us just to pick up some of the main points that were made in the questions so far. But before we do that, I just want to introduce Albert Gannon from the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, who is just going to very briefly outline the next steps the department see in the road to support the implementation of nature-based urban rainwater management. Albert.
Thanks, Adrian. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, first of all, to the presenters today. Fantastic job, and I think it's inspirational stuff. What I want to just give a few minutes to talk about is from what's out there, what we're doing, what's happening. So I think Isla gave us some indication there, and I'll tip on some of those. But really what I want people to keep an eye out for is the Deemer's Advice Note 5, which is the Design Manual for Urban Roads and Streets. There's a new Advice Note 5 coming out, which is the road and street drainage using nature-based solutions. This should be published in the next few weeks, so please keep an eye out on the Deemer's website for that. We're also working with Cork County Council and other local authorities to develop a rainwater management plan template, and this again should be out in a few months. So it should be there for people to use as a template when they need to do theirs. In discussions with Engineers Ireland, they've run a very successful Fundamentals in Nature-Based Urban Infrastructure Design and Practical Steps for Delivery course. They've run 2 already. There's another one that's going to be, it's now available online. It's, in Clyde Road on the 29th of June is the next session. In relation to this, if anybody, is there an interest to do it in any of the region areas or online, please let us know. Give Engineers Ireland an email, let them know, and if there's enough of an appetite, I'm sure that could be facilitated. Along with Engineers Ireland, we're also engaging with the professional bodies, because as we know, nature-based solutions isn't just about engineers, it's a multidisciplinary team that's needed. So really what what we've done is we've worked with ourselves in the department, Law Pro, Engineers Ireland, and the other bodies of the architects, planners, landscape architects to pull together some conversations to see where we need to go in training wise in both the private and public sector for this. So I'd feel free to contact your professional body and get in touch with them to get your feelings on the ground there, and we'll have those discussions and see where they lead. In relation to the River Basin Management Plan, because this is where this is all leading and we're looking at water quality, just to give an update, we're currently editing and finalising the text and the programme and measures of the plan, following which there'll be a number of stages which will require to be completed. This includes review by WPAC, an appropriate assessment process, graphic design, Irish language translation, and finally ministerial and government approval of the plan. But it is anticipated that this much awaited plan will be launched in Q3 of this year. As a fallout from this plan, we have a number of measures, and Isla talked about one of them. There is 2 particular projects in the nature-based solutions area that I want to talk about. One, they're monitoring pilot projects. One will be based in Dublin City Council and the other will be based in Cork County Council. So they're looking particularly in an Irish context about nature-based solutions, monitoring before and after installation, what will happen, and so we're looking forward to the results of these. Isla talked about the demonstrator, which is the very first stage in the one in Cove, and I'd welcome everyone to go down and have a look at the demonstrator down on East Beach in Cove. We're also looking at some further pilot projects in the future, and which will showcase nature-based solutions, and there'll be more information on that again. Our colleagues in LawPro are engaging with Uisce Éireann as well to produce before and after design specifications which integrate nature-based solutions from commonly encountered planning applications. And LawPro are also working to support nature-based solutions with the various Water Framework Directive governance committees, the relevant agencies, local authorities and CAROs. So you'll see them, I'm sure you've liaised with them before on that. As of I suppose the end of this webinar series, because it is our 4th, we do intend to send out a survey to all the registered attendees to look for your views on where you think we should be going. We all know that this is the way forward, it's the way of the future, and it's how we can mainstream it, how we can make it that nature-based solutions just happens as a norm when it's possible on each project. So we will be sending that out, and I encourage you please to fill it out and give us your views. Just to let people know, there are other resources available. As you know, this webinar is recorded. There are 3 others that were done previously. They are all available on the Engineers Ireland website. And then there's another previous webinar from Engineers Ireland also on that website. There are other webinars on the LawPro website which deal with different projects, specifically in the active travel area, and also highlighted towards project managers of URDF or ORDF funding. They look at different projects. It might be interesting to have a look when you need some resources when you're thinking about your nature-based solutions in your project. There's the advice note that was published by the department, and that's the nature-based solutions to the management of rainwater and surface water runoff in urban areas. And there's also and that's available on the department's website, Department of Housing's website, sorry. There's also a number of SUDS guidance documents which have been published in the last, I suppose, 18 months. Some of the ones that come to mind are the Dublin City and the South Dublin County Council guidance documents. They're definitely worth a look when you're having a look at designing your own specific guidance. I just want to take this opportunity to thank the speakers today really for their insights. And I think they've provided a great resource to go back when we know these are recorded, we can go back and have a look at what their specifications, what their plant selections, Isla, thank you for that. And all the do's and don'ts, I think, Ian, were fantastic. I'd also like to thank the chairs of the session today. We've Adrian Conway, but we had Stephen O'Malley, Finola Driscoll, and Conor Galvin. And I'd like to thank them. They've kept us in line in this whole webinar series, and I think it's been very helpful. I'd also just like to take a moment to thank Elva and Alex and Engineers Ireland. It's run very smoothly over the last 4 weeks, and that takes an awful lot of effort. So thank you guys, you've done a great job. Obviously, today I would like to thank LawPro as well, specifically Fran. He is not here today. He sends apologies. He's in Dublin Castle presenting on nature-based solutions, which is great. We're reaching even a wider audience. But I'd like to thank him and Jimmy for all the work that they've put in on LawPro's behalf. And finally, I'd just like to thank you, the attendees. It wouldn't happen without people and without the appetite out there and people wanting to hear what's going on. So please fill in the survey. Let us know what you're thinking. Let us see where we can go and how we can make nature-based solutions much more normal, much more mainstreamed in all our projects. Thanks, Adrian.